Good evening, and welcome to the 7th Annual John E. McGinty Lecture in History at Salve, Regina University. I'm Bill Lehman, a professor of history and director of the Pell Honors Program here at Salve. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the McGinty family for their longstanding support of the History Department and this annual lecture series. The John E. McGinty Fund in History was established in honor of the late John E. McGinty, former Salve trustee, and father of 2001 Salve Regina graduate John W. McGinty. The fund furthers the educational advancement of undergraduate students in history in numerous ways here at Salve, and we're grateful to the McGinty family for their continued generosity and support. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker. Dr. Craig L. Symonds is Professor Emeritus of History at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, where he taught for 30 years, including 4 years as chair of the Department of History. He was the first person to win both the Naval Academy's Teacher of the Year Award and Researcher of the Year Award. In 1989, he received the Navy Meritorious Service Award and has been awarded the Superior Civilian Service Medal 4 times. During the 1994-95 academic year, he was a visiting professor of strategy at the Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, England. And from 2017 to 2020, he served as the Ernest J. King Distinguished Professor of Maritime History at the U.S. Naval War College here in Newport. Dr. Symonds is the author of 17 books, which have been translated into 6 foreign languages, and the editor or co-editor of another 13 books. Among his books are biographies of Civil War figures Joseph E. Johnston, Patrick Cleburne, and Franklin Buchanan, as well as books on the Second World War, including the Battle of Midway, Operation Neptune, and World War II at Sea, A Global History. His 2005 book, Decision at Sea, 5 Naval Battles That Shaped American History, won the Theodore and Franklin D. Roosevelt Prize for Naval History. In his 2008 book, Lincoln and His Admirals, Abraham Lincoln, the U.S. Navy, and the Civil War won the Lincoln Prize. Most recently, Dr. Symonds published a wartime biography of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz entitled Nimitz at War, Command Leadership from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, which was released in 2022 and won the Gilder Lehrman Military History Prize. This book will be available for purchase after the lecture, and Dr. Symonds will be happy to sign your copy. In 2014, the Naval Historical Foundation awarded Dr. Symonds the Dudley Knox Medal for Lifetime Achievement in Naval History. And in 2023, the Pritzker Military Museum and Library awarded him the Pritzker Prize for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. We are very fortunate to have one of the country's preeminent military historians with us this evening as Salve Regina University concludes its commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Craig Symonds.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that very kind and fulsome introduction. I'm a little embarrassed, to be honest. I also want to thank all of you for being here tonight on such a beautiful evening here in Newport. What a delightful day this has been. And I want to thank Salve Regina University and the McGinty family in particular for sponsoring this lecture series. I think it's important, maybe especially now, to cultivate and embrace a thoughtful engagement with our own history, or at least a sensitivity to the past. As I said to Dr. Lehman's class this morning, history is not merely a list of things that happened or great works of persons now dead, nor is it a vehicle for nationalistic self-congratulation. It is instead a way, in my view, the best way, maybe the only way, to obtain the kind of nuanced understanding, the background and insight necessary to see things clearly, to understand people and culture and ideas. It is almost like having several thousand years of personal experience to draw upon that allows each of us to confront almost any issue now with deeper understanding, more awareness, and greater empathy. And without it, I think we're simply groping blindly toward whatever future we have. So thank you, Salve, thank you, McGinty family, for sponsoring this series. In Ecclesiastes, you can read that there is nothing new under the sun. That implies, at least, that almost anything you encounter in your lives today has an antecedent somewhere in history. On the other hand, the ancient historian Heraclitus wrote that you never step in the same stream twice. And that's because by the time you step into it a second time, the pebbles have moved, the water has moved downstream, the twigs that float past are different. It may be a different season. Perhaps the stream is frozen. In short, there are no such things as perfect analogies. So how do we reconcile these two pieces of wisdom from the ancient past? Nothing is new, but nothing is the same. The answer is that having crossed that stream once, or watched someone else cross the stream, or even read a book about someone crossing the stream, can prepare you for the kinds of problems, some of them familiar, some of them entirely new, that will confront you when you attempt to cross it yourself. This, I suspect, is what Mark Twain meant when he said, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So thank you, Salve, for sponsoring this series. I'm going to spend my hour or so this evening talking about leadership in the Second World War, as the title suggests here on the screen. Leadership is kind of a squishy topic anymore. There are lots of books that will purport to explain to you or list for you the 7 or 8 or 12 secrets to effective leadership in business and politics and life and athletics. I've always been a little skeptical of such lists. As an historian, I think leadership is best understood when you see it in context, and no one rule can fit all circumstances. You never step in the same stream twice. To some, effective leadership means dominating the room, enforcing one's will on others, being in charge. That's the kind of leadership of an Alexander or a Napoleon or a Hitler. Others may come to mind. Such a view implies the need for a powerful personality who can direct and govern events. An extension, I'm not particularly fond of this explanation either. But there is a different kind of leadership, one exemplified by the individuals I'm going to talk about tonight. And as a nation, we have often been very fortunate in the leaders available to us. Am I doing this right? I'll try this one. Nope. Help, Aaron. Have I got the right device here? Oh, here she comes. I didn't mean to make you run all the way down here.
That's what I'm here for.
It wasn't just me. I want the record to show. What do I need to do?
Just hit that button.
That one. Okay. Thank you very much. As I say, America has been quite fortunate in often having the leaders it needs at critical moments. Obviously, the Civil War gave Abraham Lincoln the opportunity to emerge as what almost universally historians and the general public, too, I think, consider America's greatest president. And of course, the Great Depression and the Second World War gave Franklin Roosevelt an opportunity to demonstrate his leadership skills. Neither man had a desire to enforce his will Oh, he knew which direction was important for the nation to take. That was not the issue. They succeeded by nudging the country in the direction they believed it needed to go. In fact, a direction essential to its survival. Both of them are models for leadership in troubled times. But tonight I'm going to look at two other leaders, both of them military leaders, one Army, one Navy. I had to do that to be fair-handed. They presided, as the title of the lecture suggests, over different theaters, the two largest and most impactful military theaters of the Second World War, the largest war in global history, on opposite sides of the world. They were each thrust into those leadership positions at a particularly dark moment in American history and in world history for that matter, and despite that, they persevered, even triumphed. How did they do that? Can we identify the elements, the characteristics of the kind of leadership that they demonstrated by taking a look at them? Here's the first one. Let's see if, and a look at that, it works. This is Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. He's the lesser known of the two, perhaps because he never became president. I wonder how many of you could have identified him from this photograph before tonight? It's not bad. Only a few, though. Most Americans could not. Interestingly, I gave a talk on Admiral Nimitz to a group of Naval Academy graduates a couple of months ago. And this slide was on the screen all during dinner before the talk. And I was told afterward that one such grad turned to his dining partner and said, "How come he has a picture of Eisenhower up there?" That guy did not take my class. The two men did have a lot in common, as we'll see, but they did not really look that much alike. Now, if you look at Nimitz's collar device here, both on his shoulder and on his collar, he's wearing 4 stars. That's the rank of a full United States admiral. But on December 7th, 1941, he wore only 2 stars. At that time, he was in charge of what is now known as the Navy Bureau of Personnel, essentially orchestrating officer assignments for the Navy from a desk in Washington. He was a paper pusher. Yet it was a job that put him in regular contact with the administration, and in particular with Franklin Roosevelt, who got to know him very well and who considered himself very much a Navy man. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson during the First World War. And Roosevelt came to know and respect Chester Nimitz. This is the guy he wanted. In fact, FDR nominated Nimitz to be the commander of the Pacific Fleet a year before Pearl Harbor in the summer of 1940. Nimitz turned it down. He said, "There are too many admirals in the Navy who are senior to me and would be offended by this appointment. It would make my life difficult in trying to manage the fleet under those circumstances. So thank you very much. I'm honored, Mr. President, but no thank you." That apparent self-denial turned out to be kind of providential, because if Nimitz had been in command of the fleet in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, there's no guarantee things would have been any different, and he might have been shelved, as Admiral Husband Kimmel was, and take responsibility for the success of the Japanese attack, and therefore not been available to us for the Second World War. But after the Japanese attack, after December 7th, 1941, FDR's Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, came into Nimitz's office and said, "I've just been to see the president, and he wants you to take command, and he won't take no for an answer." Supposedly, the words that he used were, "Tell Nimitz to get the hell out to Pearl Harbor and don't come back until the war is won." Whether he used that exact language or not, it certainly conveys the sense of what he wanted. So Nimitz flew out to Pearl Harbor, arriving there early on Christmas Day of 1941, and took formal command of the fleet on New Year's Eve, at which point He was then authorized, by virtue of holding that billet, to wear the 4 stars we see on his collar here. That's a pretty quick promotion. The body language here is kind of interesting. He looks, what would you say, determined, austere, maybe a little challenging. Idiosyncratic characteristics you want, perhaps, in a commander. But it may be a bit misleading. Virtually every one of the photos I'm going to show you tonight, in fact, every photo taken of Admiral Nimitz during the war shows him with this grim, closed-mouthed expression on his face. It did not reflect a dour or grim personality. It was because he didn't want to show his teeth. Nimitz grew up in the hill country of Texas, not too far, by the way, from the Pedernales River, where LBJ also grew up. But he never saw a dentist, Nimitz that is, not LBJ. He never saw a dentist until he got to the Naval Academy. And the dentist took one look at his mouth and said, oh, these got to come out. His grandson was kind enough to send me his medical record from the academy, and his teeth are listed as simply missing. He had, I think, 5 left, but they were all capped in gold, and he just did not want to show his teeth, so he didn't. But I think this photo also shows an aspect of his personality, an important aspect. He was reserved, restrained, low-key. Here's an example of that. Ordinarily, the change in command as a new admiral came in to take over the responsibility of the entire Pacific Fleet, that would take place on a battleship. Well, there weren't many battleships left now, but it could have been on an aircraft carrier, a heavy cruiser, any number of other ships that were available. No, Nimitz instead decided he would hold the change of command on a submarine. Now, partly this may be because he began his career in submarines back in 1905 when he was a new graduate out of the Naval Academy, but also because I think he just wanted to not make a big deal out of it. No bands, no children waving flags, no parades, no ceremonies. It just wasn't the time for that. There were far more serious things to do. And after the formal change of command, a reporter, maybe that guy in the fedora with his notebook down in the lower left of the photograph, came up to Nimitz and asked him for a comment for the papers. No doubt he was looking for something that would make a great headline, you know, like, damn the torpedoes, or I have not yet begun to fight. No, he got nothing like that. Nimitz heard the question, thoughtfully nodded and said, all we can do is bide our time and look for opportunities that might come along. Well, that's not the stuff of headlines. What am I going to do with this? But it is an insight into who Nimitz was. All right, that's one. Our other person of interest tonight is this guy, and this is Dwight Eisenhower, who was also largely unknown on the day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He wore only 1 star as a brigadier general and a planning officer. If Roosevelt was the one who plucked Nimitz from relative obscurity and put him in command in the Pacific, the guy who did that for Eisenhower was this fellow, George C. Marshall. I put his picture up here because although he's not one of our 2 that we're focusing on, I think he's a much underappreciated hero of the Second World War. He never led troops in the war. He never led a charge ashore. He didn't draw his sword and say, take that hill, follow me, boys. But he, more than any other individual, was responsible for crafting and working with allies to develop the overall strategic planning for Allied success in World War II. And he seldom gets credit for that. If he's remembered, it's mostly for the Marshall Plan as Secretary of State under Harry Truman, which also is much to his credit. Like Nimitz, Eisenhower's default personality was restraint. was quiet, he was unassuming, reliable, utterly competent. He was easy to take for granted because you didn't have to look over his shoulder. You knew it would get done. It would get done on time. It would get done efficiently. Perhaps most important, he had the kind of temperament that allowed him to get along with just about everybody. They really did like Ike. He had served as an aide to Douglas MacArthur. And if you can be successful in that job, you can do anything. This next picture I'm going to show you, get ready for it. You might love this photograph. It says a lot about a couple of things. Number one, I don't think jodhpurs are going to come back. I think this is a fashion trend that has seen its day. But look at how young Ike looks standing there next to him. Here's MacArthur and Eisenhower in the Philippines before the war, when Eisenhower was just a young pup. I think he's a major here, if I look at his collar device. It's a great photograph, though. He not only served successfully a lengthy tenure under MacArthur, he thrived in it. When the war came to America on that December Sunday and FDR ordered Frank Knox to tell Nimitz to get the hell out to Pearl Harbor, Marshall called on Nimitz to come to Washington to become the war planner on the general staff. Marshall kept a little notebook in his pocket. He kept it with him all the time. And whenever he dealt with junior officers, or junior to him, which was everyone, he would make a little note. This is a comer. We need to watch this guy. And he had always had his eye on Eisenhower. And so it was in the dark winter of 1941-1942, with the Axis powers in virtual control of Europe, Japanese running rampant in the Pacific, these two men, both of them in their 50s, Eisenhower was 51 and Nimitz was 56, found themselves saddled with unprecedented, even awesome, I know that's an overworked word, but I'll use it here anyway, awesome, daunting responsibilities. They are the men who ran the war in the Pacific and in Europe, both Americans. I'm going to talk about the characteristics that, in my opinion, made them successful, even essential in that critical moment. But let me first note one difference between them. I mentioned that Nimitz virtually never smiled. Ike smiled all the time. His staff said his smile was worth 4 divisions, at least, to the Allied cause. And I understand what he meant by that. If it was not literally true, his public demeanor, his relentless cheerfulness acted as a bomb. It raised the morale of the troops who thought, hey, things must be going pretty well. Look how General Eisenhower is smiling. It stiffened the resolve of his peers who began to doubt and second guess the difficult circumstances, and even inspired confidence in the people above him. As I suggested, one of the things that made both of them successful was their ability to work with powerful, difficult, touchy political masters. I already mentioned Nimitz's ability to work with MacArthur. Here he is with another difficult personality. I know we admire Winston Churchill for his soaring language, holding the Allied cause together during its darkest hours. But he was a difficult guy to work with or for as well. And look at Eisenhower deploying that smile. Boy, he's got him right in the palm of his hand. And Nimitz, too, had to deal with cagey, clever, not always trustworthy political masters. Here he is at a conference in Hawaii with FDR, as FDR is trying to decide, are we going to go to Formosa or the Philippines? What do you think? Each of our 2 military commanders had enormous responsibilities. Nimitz actually commanded the largest military theater ever created in the history of organized warfare, the Pacific Ocean area. 65 million square miles of territory from Hawaii to Japan, from Alaska to Australia. And he not only commanded the fleet, he wasn't just the Navy commander, he was the theater commander. He commanded the Navy, the Army, the Air Forces of the United States, of Britain, of New Zealand, of Australia, of the Free French, and of anybody else who raised their hand to be on our side. He was a coalition commander. In addition to which, so was Eisenhower's, who commanded, again, the second largest military theater in the history of warfare in Europe. And it too was dominated by sometimes contrarian partners. We talk about the Anglo-American special relationship. I'll buy that, that's fair. They spoke more or less the same language, but they didn't always agree on things, or when to do them, or how to do them. And then, of course, there were the Dutch, the Belgians, the Norwegians, and if you say, well, they're smaller powers, yes, but they're players as well. And then there's the Free French, headed by Charles de Gaulle. Oh my gosh. If you think MacArthur's hard to get along with, there's Charles de Gaulle. Here, for example, is the team of Allied commanders for D-Day. There's Ike in the middle. But he's sandwiched between two British generals, Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory on the right, our left, who was the air commander for D-Day and had his own ideas about how air forces should be deployed in the invasion. And there's Bernard Montgomery on his left, our right, who was the ground commander. Now, Montgomery in particular was a difficult character, a volatile, voluble character, convinced of his own genius, aren't we all? And likely to dismiss the Americans as mere amateurs. On the far left of this photo, for example, is Omar Bradley, the soldiers general, right? Well, Montgomery thought Bradley was a dummy. And Bradley fully reciprocated. He thought Montgomery was a show pony, an egotistical show pony at that. I love this photo. This is Ike. And this says a lot. It's kind of a metaphor for Ike's role, Eisenhower's role. They're in the middle. Of course, he's in the middle. And there's Montgomery leaning in, talking. He's always talking, right? Saying, this is the way it should be done. Let me tell you why. And then on the right, there's Omar Bradley. Now, notice that body language. Oh, yeah? And there were many others equally difficult. I haven't even mentioned George Patton, though I will. Nimitz also had to manage a disparate group of high-ranking officers. Here he is with a group of admirals. Look how many there are, good heavens. That's Nimitz on the extreme left, turning his head to look at the camera. Many of the commanders who are pretty important in their own right. There's one captain back there in the back, kind of peeking around the corner. All the rest of them are admirals. And it's like herding snakes, herding cats, whatever cliche you want to use. He had to keep all these people moving in the same direction with the same purpose, and that was not necessarily difficult. So for both Nimitz and for Eisenhower, command, leadership, if you would, required not just military prowess, strategic insight, not just forcefulness and determination, it required a nuanced diplomatic temperament. It was necessary not only to have a clear-eyed view of grand strategy and how to employ the forces at your command, but also to listen carefully, ask questions, nod sympathetically when hinting at maybe other possible alternatives. Sometimes it meant convincing your putative subordinates that the plan you had in mind had originated with them. How clever of you! I can't wait to see how you're able to pull this off. This should be amazing. And when they did, or even if they didn't, to support them, back them up, distribute medals, and congratulate them for their hard work. It was less bluster and a lot more hand-holding. Not an easy thing to do, and requires, as I suggested, a particular kind of temperament. Well, I've already argued in my introductory talks that leadership is best learned by witnessing it, watching it, seeing it. So let's look at one example from each of these guys to see how they dealt with a particularly tricky personnel problem. And I'll start with Nimitz. I mentioned that in managing that enormous theater, the Pacific Ocean area, Nimitz had to deal with challenging personalities. In addition to Roosevelt and MacArthur, he also had to satisfy his immediate boss, who was this guy. And if you think Nimitz looked grim, King was the grimmest of them all. He was grimace himself. Very difficult man to please. He had to coordinate, and Nimitz, that is, had also to coordinate and pacify tricky subordinates. I mean, we can get a sense of the kinds of problems that are likely to present to Nimitz just from their nicknames. Bull, Halsey. Terrible, Turner. Howling Mad, Smith. These were his field commanders, sea commanders. And of course, there's always this guy, who was theoretically his co-equal, commanding the Southwest Pacific area, while Nimitz commanded the Pacific Ocean area. But MacArthur was immeasurably senior to Nimitz and thought Nimitz should do whatever he thought. Nimitz had to deal with that too. So to demonstrate how Nimitz survived this shark tank of fractious and contrarian individuals, I'm going to use the example, maybe the obvious example, of the Battle of Midway. From the start of his command on that New Year's Eve in 1941, Nimitz established a protocol with his intelligence officer, Ed Layton. That's Layton on the left. If you saw the movie Midway, he was played by Patrick Wilson, who is the fellow on the right. And I've always been curious, why does everybody look better in the movies than they did in real life? It's certainly true here. It may or may not also be true here. See what you think. Huh? Huh? I think Nimitz looks pretty good here, actually. But anyway, Nimitz had arranged for Layton to come in and see him every morning at 8 o'clock with whatever information his codebreakers had gleaned from the basement codebreaker's office, where they were trying to read Japanese codes. There's a theory about this that we read their mail. That's not quite true. We got little tiny bits of information, but Layton came in and said, we think, but we're not sure, that the Japanese are planning an attack on the tiny two-island atoll of Midway, so named because it's more or less midway across the Pacific. This was no sure thing. The codebreakers, as I said, could decrypt only tiny bits of radio messages, and those radio messages contained lots of several geographical descriptors, so when and where and how much, we're not sure, but they worked on it literally 24 hours a day. Now, it's a good thing, certainly, to know the enemy's plans or think you know the enemy's plans, but it's no guarantee of success. Excuse me. Nimitz knew, or thought he knew, that the Japanese were coming, more or less when they were coming, that they were coming with at least 4 aircraft carriers, and Nimitz had only 3 in the entirety of the Pacific Ocean. His 4th aircraft carrier, the Lexington, had just been sunk in the Coral Sea, and one of the 3 that still floated had been badly damaged there and was limping back to Pearl Harbor, trailing a 10-mile slick of oil. And of course, Nimitz had no battleships at all. So there's that. He also knew that the Allied overall strategy for World War II was to defeat the Germans first. The Germans were perceived correctly as the more dangerous enemy in this war. Their GDP was 4 times that of the Japanese. They already controlled most of Europe. Let's take care of that problem first. Then we can deal with the Japanese. So why not let them have these 2 little islands? I mean, big deal, right? They will have a hard time supplying that because it's 3,000 miles away from Tokyo. And we can take it back pretty much whenever we want. So maybe the best thing to do here is nothing. But here Nimitz applied what he called calculated risk. Measure the value of the objective against what you might lose if you undertake it. Midway was valuable, not existential particularly, but it also had an airfield, as you can see. So if I can patch up that wounded carrier, and I can use this airfield, that's 4 airplane platforms, and they're coming with 4 carriers, that looks pretty good to me, and we know they're coming. And they don't know that we know. So on the basis of all that, he decided that he would take this challenge. He would send his carriers out early to an ambush position and attack the Japanese as they approached Midway. Okay, good plan. And then the other 2 carriers come into port, commanded by Bill Halsey. And Halsey reports himself to Nimitz's office, and he can barely stand up. He's got a terrible skin disease over much of his body, including half his face and down his chest. Probably shingles. We think now that that's probably what it was. And Nimitz said, Bill, you have got to go to the hospital right now. You are in no condition to exercise command at sea. But before you go, who do you recommend to take your place? And he didn't hesitate in recommending Raymond Spruance, also seen here wearing 4 stars. This is a later picture in the war. But Spruance was very much a character like Nimitz, something that you can perhaps discern in this comparison. That's Nimitz on the left, by the way, but not that you need to be told. But on the so Nimitz is taking a risk here in accepting the Japanese challenge. Japanese had superior forces at sea. We have an untested commander now who's got to go out and confront them. This is going to be dicey. And what if the code breakers are wrong? I mean, in all the codes and all the messages that they had read, the target was identified by the radio traffic as AF, which they said, well, that's Midway. Well, how do you know that it's Midway? What if you're wrong about that? Some of you probably heard the story. It's one of the most often told stories about the Battle of Midway, that in order to prove that they were right, the code breakers told the people on Midway, send us a radio message in the clear saying that your saltwater desalinators that create fresh water have broken down and that you're short on fresh water. And then we'll wait. Wait. Jeopardy music. Da, 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 da. And sure enough, in a day, they intercepted a Japanese radio message that said AF is short of fresh water. There you go. We got it figured out. As for Nimitz's orders to give to Spruance and the other task force commanders, he told them the goal here is not to slug it out with the Japanese. There are more of them. They have more airplanes. You should be governed by calculated risk. If it looks like you're on the losing end of this thing, head east. Get out of there. Let them have Midway. It's not that big a deal. We can get it back later. Well, you probably know how it worked out. The ambush that Nimitz crafted caught the Japanese at a critical moment, and in a 5-point pivot of history, 3 Japanese carriers were hit and in a sinking condition, and they got the 4th one later that afternoon. It was a clean sweep. Sunk all 4 Japanese carriers. We lost one of our own, but they lost all 4. It was a blow from which the Japanese never really recovered. But there is an epilogue to this story, and in a way, that's the center point of the argument I want to make here. It's much lesser known and says a lot about Nimitz and his command style and his temperament. When Spruance returned to Pearl Harbor after the battle, he reported to Nimitz that the captain of one of the 3 American carriers, who was in charge of that carrier task group, had defied orders and sent his airplanes in the wrong direction. Well, that'll happen. Worse, though, that officer submitted an after-action report that was dishonest. No, I didn't. I sent them the right way. They just didn't find the Japanese. Chances of war. The culprit was this guy. This is Mark Mitcher. who was a captain of the aircraft carrier Hornet. Mitchell was a very early pioneer in naval aviation. He was 55 years old at the time, but as a contemporary said, he didn't look a day over 80. Now, Spruance's revelations here about Mitcher's behavior were shocking, but what was Nimitz to do about it? If he called Mitcher to account and said you did the wrong thing and then you lied about it, essentially, perhaps he would convene a court-martial. Well, that would sully the greatest victory in the history of the United States Navy. That's what everyone would talk about. Instead of that great victory at Midway, it would take away the glow of triumph and replace it with a tawdry court-martial. On the other hand, if he didn't confront him, would subordinate commanders say, well, I can do whatever I want, and I can say whatever I want, and I can get away with it. And he didn't really want to lose Mitcher. Mitcher, as I mentioned, was one of the most experienced senior naval aviators in the entire service. He didn't want to throw him under the bus. So he did not challenge Mitcher openly. Instead, he forwarded Mitcher's false report to King, although there is evidence that he told him quietly on the QT that not all of it was trustworthy, and assigned Mitcher to command of a seaplane squadron on the north shore of Hawaii. He put him on the shelf. But he didn't throw him away. Nimitz would invite him regularly to headquarters to have dinner with other admirals when they were visiting. And the next year, Nimitz gave Mitcher command of the air forces around Guadalcanal during that campaign, and then eventually gave him command of a carrier, and then a carrier task group. And by late 1944, he was the commander of all American carriers in the Pacific and spearheaded the campaign from Hawaii to the very shores of Japan itself. And he won the nickname the Magnificent Mitcher, which, of course, never would have happened if he'd simply thrown him away. For 50 years and more, Mitcher's behavior at the Battle of Midway remained secret. Nobody knew, or very few people knew. Spruance knew. Historians relied on Mitcher's official report to tell the Battle of Midway. Only recently did his true role become known. But it is Nimitz's decision about how to manage this that was particularly interesting to me. Here, he relies on a different kind of calculated risk. He knew that exposing Mitcher's failures would undercut public morale at a time when, boy, did the nation need a boost, badly, in the summer of 1942. So while he moved Mitcher aside, temporarily, he kept him available, a decision that was validated by Mitcher's subsequent behavior in 1944 and 1945. You can decide for yourself what matters most, exacting punitive justice or securing the greater good for the service and the country. We've got a Q&A coming up after this, so you think about that. And what about Eisenhower? I already mentioned Ike's ability to get along with really almost anyone. Having been MacArthur's aide, turned out to be useful preparation for being the supreme Allied commander. He learned how to be a loyal member of a team while remaining true to his own principles, a delicate balancing act that prepared him to deal with not only Roosevelt and Churchill, but also British Chief of Staff General Alan Brooke, prickly guy on his own, Charles de Gaulle, for crying out loud. Indeed, with Eisenhower, as with Nimitz, the key to success during the war was a measured temperament. You know, Eisenhower never led troops in battle in his entire career. He's one of the three probably most famous military commanders in American history. Never pulled a trigger against the enemy, never led a charge, never directed troops in combat. But he did this. In 1942, he wrote in his diary, "In a war such as this, where high command invariably involves a president, a prime minister, 6 chiefs of staff, a horde of lesser planners, there has got to be a lot of patience." Patience is not a characteristic many Americans would put near the top of prerequisites for effective military command, but I think that's exactly where it belongs. Eisenhower was thoughtful and conscientious, a deliberate decision maker who worked very long hours, maintained very careful records, made sure everybody was kept in the loop so that nobody was caught out by surprise. And these are keys to success in any undertaking, but absolutely essential in war, especially a war conducted by a coalition of a dozen different nations. And throughout it all, despite bureaucratic snafus, logistical failures, petty squabblings among subordinates, he remained cheerful, relentlessly cheerful, encouraging and optimistic, deploying that smile worth 4 divisions. Now, partly this is just an element of his personality. It's who he was. But partly, too, it's the fact that this was what he showed to the world. It doesn't mean he really was relaxed and comfortable with all that he had to manage, all that he had to do. Evidence that he was roiling inside is suggested by the fact that throughout 1944, he smoked 4 packs of unfiltered Camel cigarettes every day. 4 packs a day. And it says something even more about him, that when the war was over in 1946, he quit cold turkey. Boom. He was done. So in addition to presenting a happy and confident face to the world, he had a natural human empathy, as did Nimitz. He took seriously the concerns of his commanders, and if he had to disagree with them, he explained why he had to disagree. Among those difficult personalities, here we go, was this guy. This is George S. Patton, Jr., who, like Mitcher, was a warrior in personality type and behavior. He had a warrior's ethos. There's that pearl-handled revolver. Also, like Mitcher, he had enormous confidence in himself and in his own judgment, and a matching disdain for those who disagreed with him. He would not have been the person you wanted in Eisenhower's position, and you probably wouldn't have wanted Eisenhower in Patton's position. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, now recognized as a medical health condition, then known as battle fatigue, or in the First World War, shell shock, was a real thing. But as far as Patton was concerned, it was no more than a lack of character, even cowardice. All men are afraid, he wrote in his diary, but real men will carry on anyway. And while visiting hospitals in Sicily in August of 1943, Patton evinced genuine sympathy for those who bore physical wounds evident in their body. Then he came across one man who was sitting up in bed. His whole body was shaking violently, but there were no visible signs of a wound. And the doctor accompanying Patton told him the soldier was suffering from battle fatigue. Well, Patton just exploded. "You are just a goddamned coward, you yellow son of a bitch." The soldier then began to sob, and Patton leaned over and slapped him across the face. "Shut up that goddamn crying." Then he struck him again, hard enough that his helmet liner flew into the next tent. Then turning to the hospital admissions officer, he yelled, "Don't admit this yellow bastard. There's nothing the matter with him." And turning back to the soldier, who was trying his best to sit at attention and stop shaking and stop crying, he said, "You are going back to the front, and you may get shot, and you may get killed, but you are going to fight, and if you don't, I'll stand you up in front of a wall and have you shot by firing squad. In fact," and then he reached for the pistol on his hip, "I ought to shoot you myself, you goddamn whimpering coward." Well, different temperament from Eisenhower or Nimitz. That might have been the end of it, because no official report about it was ever forwarded through the military chain of command. But the doctor who had witnessed it sent it up through the medical chain of command, and that's how Eisenhower learned about it. Ike's dilemma was similar to the one Nimitz faced. Making the incident public would depress morale, perhaps drive him, his most aggressive and successful ground commander, out of the Army. On the other hand, he could not ignore it. Like Nimitz, he decided to handle it internally. He wrote a blistering letter to Patton, telling him the incident made him question Patton's judgment and even his fitness for command. He ordered him to apologize to the man he had slapped, actually there were two of them, and to the Army generally in a series of public confessions, which Patton did. Case closed, or not. Unlike the news of Mitcher's errors at Midway, word of the slapping incident got out. The syndicated newspaper columnist Drew Pearson publicized it back in the States, where reactions were divided. Most Americans found it horrifying that a general would slap around a soldier who had just come out of combat. Others saw it as exactly what was called for. Come on, had no drill instructor ever manhandled a recruit? The Army was not a babysitter, you know. Now that the incident was public, Ike had to do something more. He could have fired Patton, sent him home, and he seriously considered it. He might have demoted him from 3-star to 1-star. But he didn't want to lose Patton's obvious talents for combat. So Nimitz did, as Nimitz had done with Mitcher, Eisenhower shelved him temporarily. Patton had hoped and expected to lead the American invasion, the Allied invasion of the beaches in Normandy, D-Day. He expected to be the commanding officer of that, but that job went to Omar Bradley. Remember him? Patton was employed as a decoy. The Germans knew that Patton was the Allies' most effective ground commander, and when Eisenhower made him the commander of a mythical Allied army in southeastern England, the Germans assumed that that army, which didn't exist, and Patton would lead it, and that the attack would probably be at the Pas de Calais, where the channel is narrowest. This was part of what was known as Operation Fortitude, an elaborate misinformation campaign designed to keep the Germans from discovering that the true object of their invasion would be the Normandy coast. And again, like Nimitz, Eisenhower brought Patton back. Only a month after the successful landings in Normandy of June 1944, and a year after the slapping incident, about the time that Mitcher was returned to command in the Pacific, Eisenhower assigned Patton to command the 3rd Army, which became the spearhead for the Allied drive across France from the beachhead in Normandy all the way to the liberation of Paris and the crossing of the Rhine. In addition to the deft management of his generals, Eisenhower also made a point of talking with the rank and file whenever he could. He wanted to get a feeling for the soldiers' morale. And just before the D-Day operation, as an example, he made a point to visit as many men who were going to be dropped into France in the middle of the night prior to the invasion the next morning. Here, in a photograph that is often duplicated, we see him talking to a group of the 101st Airborne. It's often shown to demonstrate Eisenhower's determination. Now, men, you're going to fight and fight hard and we will win. The actual story is quite different. As he told his granddaughter Susan, who told me the story, when he talked to soldiers, Eisenhower always began by asking, "Where are you from, soldier?" This soldier, the tall fellow with the number 23 on his chest, was from Michigan. "Oh, Michigan," Eisenhower said. "Great fly fishing in Michigan." And you know the secret to great fly fishing? You got to keep your thumb on the reel when you cast. It creates a perfect arc for the cast. And you can see his thumb right there on the reel as he's making that cast. He's trying to connect personally with the soldiers. As these examples suggest, for both of these men, leadership and decision-making was not a matter of will, determination, certainty, drive, bluster, and bluff. It's the product of careful calculation, sleepless nights of contemplating the costs and the benefits, of empathetic and thoughtful management of your team, of your subordinates, of your peers, of your superiors, and a willingness to accept the consequences afterward. I'll end with this. Love this photo. It was taken after the war when Nimitz had been made Chief of Naval Operations, the head of the Navy, replacing King, his former nemesis, and Eisenhower became Chief of Staff of the Army, replacing George Marshall. In those jobs, they both played critical roles in the development of post-war U.S. policy toward both Europe and Japan. Both men were champions of a soft peace and the reconstruction of their former enemies. Both were deeply involved in the defense unification controversies of the post-war era. The same calm temperament that got them through the war so successfully allowed them to succeed in those roles as well. Note that, once again, Nimitz is closed-mouthed here. I'm not showing my teeth. Eisenhower grinning away, as usual. Note, too, the sprigs of mint coming out of their glasses. Now, that could be iced tea, I suppose. I suspect otherwise. I think they're probably mint juleps. Years later, when Eisenhower was president, he sent a copy of this photo to Nimitz, inscribed as follows: "To my old comrade in arms, of wars in the field and wars in Washington, from his devoted friend, Dwight Eisenhower." Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Now the fun part is Q&A, and I'm told I can turn on my little device here so that I can get away from the podium. Maybe. I had trouble with the other device. Let's see if I can make this one work. Can you hear me still? Hey, that's great.
So we've got a couple of microphones that are out in the audience. So if you've got a question, raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you, and we'll get it answered. While you're pondering, though, maybe I'll just throw a question on the table to get the conversation started. So, so first of all, thank you. That was wonderful, and we're so grateful.
I love that question. More like that.
More like that.
That's a great question.
Both Nimitz and Ike are products of a democratic society. And so you made that distinction very early about there are different styles of leadership. There's sort of command, but there's also a different kind of command, not just born of the rank and the status, but how do you actually manage even militaries in a democracy? Can you talk about their respective approaches to those specific challenges?
I think it's helpful that they both grew up in very modest circumstances and had to learn to deal early on. I mean, Nimitz was orphaned quite young. His father died before he was born. His father died at 29 of a heart attack, 29. And because of that, Nimitz became an inveterate exerciser. He was always walking to and fro, doing Herculean swims in the ocean to take care of himself physically. But because he was raised by his grandparents in the hill country of Texas, I think it developed a point of view that I'm no better than anyone else. And as for Eisenhower, he was born in Texas, interestingly enough, but raised in Kansas, which he always considered his ancestral home. And he, too, I think, developed a sense of responsibility quite early on. I'd like to give credit to West Point, but I'm not going to, because it would hurt so much. But I think to a certain extent, a lot of it is just internal. There are people who came from modest circumstances and went to West Point and graduated in the class of 1905 or 1910 and went into the war and were not great commanders. So it's personal as much as it is experiential, I think, that leads to greatness, or often leads to greatness. Now, come on, don't make me do the come on. Oh, we've
got one in the back here.
Oh, good, okay, great. No?
The submarine that Nimitz assumed his command, what was the name of it, and did it survive the war?
On which he took the command. It was called the Grayback. It was one of the newer submarines. I believe it did survive the war, conducted 7, 8 wartime missions all the way to the coast of Japan. Interestingly enough, I thought you were going to ask me the name of his first submarine when he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1905 and took command of a submarine. I love the name of this. It was the Plunger. That makes you confident that everything's going to be okay. But yeah, no, that was the Grayback. All submarines are named for fish in World War II. And they got pretty desperate as more and more and more of them were launched. They had to come up with some pretty creative fish names, but the Grayback was a fish, named for a fish.
So we got one down here. So while the microphone is coming to you, here we go.
I've always thought that Eisenhower had the more difficult command management problem because his associates were from other nations.
Yeah.
And the Brits, at least in the beginning of World War II, were a equal or greater partner than the United States, which of course changed during the war, whereas Nimitz was commanding primarily a unitary force of Americans.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think that's a good observation. I do think Eisenhower's job is more difficult because he dealt with so many disparate nations and languages and circumstances and priorities. The biggest one, of course, is with the British. The British from the beginning. Remember, the British in World War I began fighting in 1914, and an entire generation of British young men was wiped out between 1914 and 1917 before the United States even got in the war. The British lost over 800,000 men, almost literally a generation in that war, and one of whom, by the way, was Winston Churchill. No, not that he died, but he did serve in the trenches after he left his post as First Lord of the Admiralty. And so he knew what war on the continent was like. So Britons generally, and Churchill in particular, were in no hurry to get back onto that continent and start fighting the Germans on the ground. The Americans, on the other hand, I'm going to tell you something that will surprise you. We're impatient. If we decide Germany first, what we really mean is Germany right now. So the Americans go in and say, well, let's attack Germany tomorrow, right? Are you ready? And the problem is the American military machinery, which would eventually become a steamroller, had not yet ginned up. If we went early, if we tried to attack in 1942, arguably even in 1943, it would have been mostly the British who had to do it. So the way the British heard it was, hey, listen, I have a good idea. We'll watch while you go back in on the continent and lose another 800,000 men. And so the British, who desperately needed the Americans, their attitude was, well, that sounds like a good idea, but how about instead if we go to, let's say, North Africa, and then Sicily, and then Italy, and Churchill was still wanted to go to the island of Rhodes, for God's sake, in 1944. So there was a fundamental disconnect, and Eisenhower had to bridge that. And this is not necessarily a command example, but I'll give it anyway. When he supervised the 1.25 million Americans who came to Britain in advance of the cross-channel invasion, some of those Americans were black. And the British had no experience with slavery. There were 8,000 black people in the entire British Isles. So when the Americans came over, they figured black guys, white guys, yeah, what's the difference? The British women would date the African-American soldiers. Well, Southern-born white American soldiers were not going to put up with that. So one of the things Eisenhower had to do was not only keep things calm between the British and the Americans, but keep things calm between the white and black Americans. And that was a struggle, too. I mean, he issued orders. Finally, he did have to compromise with that. On certain nights, the blacks would be allowed in the pubs. On other nights, the whites would be allowed in the pubs. The British couldn't understand this. What the hell is going on? When I taught at the British Naval Academy, I was told a story by an old farmer who lived there. He says, who was repeating it secondhand. He wasn't the one who witnessed it, but it was told to him. He says, when a reporter came over and asked this farmer, he said, what do you think about the Americans coming over here and taking over your fields and houses and so forth. He said, well, most of them are right fine blokes, but I don't like the white buggers they brought with them. Because the white soldiers would strut into the pubs and throw down a 5-pound note and say, yeah, your beer's warm. Whereas the black soldiers were deferential and courtly. So there were all kinds of problems. And I do think you're right. Your general question is, was Eisenhower's job more difficult because he had a variety of nations and languages and cultural expectations to deal with? Nimitz had fewer of them. On the other hand, I'm going to throw this into the pot, Nimitz dealt with MacArthur. That's the ace card. So anyway.
We've got one in the back and then one down here.
After, I don't know if this is on. Hello?
Yeah, there it is.
After Pearl Harbor and after the Battle of the Coral Sea, when we were down to 3 aircraft carriers and 1 damaged Lexington, on their approach to Midway, where did the Japanese think our aircraft carriers were?
What a great question. I didn't have time for this, but to understand Midway, you have to understand Midway was not the Japanese objective. That's not what they wanted. Midway was the bait. The idea was to threaten Midway, and the American carriers that they assumed would be in Hawaii would then come out to try to protect Midway, and the Japanese would pounce on them. But because of the code breakers, Nimitz took those carriers and sent them way up here, north of Midway, in literally the last place the Japanese looked for them, so that they could ambush the Japanese as they were coming in. So the code breakers, again, played a critical role, not only in convincing Nimitz that he could and should confront this threat, but how to confront it by sending those carriers out to the north. What the Japanese expected was not what they got, obviously. Good question, though.
A question down here, then we'll come over here.
Thanks for the great talk. I appreciate it. And thanks for your service to the Academy, the country. So at the end of 97, beginning, sorry, of 97, I was a young enlisted serviceman. And Eisenhower, so I'm going to go a little later if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Eisenhower's papers were declassified about the end of the Korean War, which I took very personal, about the POWs. Do you have any insight from him about that experience?
I don't, to be perfectly honest with you. Those papers, by the way, have subsequently been digitized and published and are available in hard-printed volumes, and there's a lot of detail in them about them. And one of the things those papers demonstrate was, I was looking at them just yesterday, in fact, November 7th, 1942, on the eve of the invasion of North Africa, he wrote like 25 letters to 25 different people. I mean, it would take me a week to do that. He did it in 1 day. So he was very conscientious in following up issues. I don't know what, if anything, were his particular viewpoints on POWs in the North Korean, in the Korean War. I'm just going to have to punt that one. I'm sorry. But I will recommend to you the papers of Dwight David Eisenhower, edited by David Chandler and Stephen Ambrose, which are available in print and easy to manipulate. You might find something in there.
We've got one in the back here.
Dr. Symonds, thanks for being here. You opened your lecture talking about the value of understanding history to understanding our own experiences. So sort of a two-part question. What was the value of history to these two men in shaping their experiences as they prepared to take on this role? And then in your studies of them, do you get a sense that they understood their own place in history?
Yeah, the answer is yes to both. I think they did have a strong sense of history. I'll give one very specific example, but one of the reasons I think Nimitz took the tack that he did in dealing with Mark Mitcher after the Battle of Midway was that when he was a plebe at the Naval Academy, he had to take a course in naval history, a course which is still taught. At the time, this was 1903, 04, it was not long after the Spanish-American War, and there'd been a big brouhaha about who should get credit for the American victory against the Spanish in the Battle of Santiago. And in the textbook, the historian wrote that Admiral Schley had run away like a coward in the battle. Well, that created a storm of protest. The books were recalled and pulped and shredded. Hard to find one of them today. There are only a few that exist. And he rewrote it and so on. But it was a big stink at the academy. People got into arguments and fistfights. Samson Hall, Schley. Samson was the guy who eventually ended up with being credited for the victory. And the fact that the history department at the Naval Academy is in Samson Hall suggests something about who won the argument. But at that time, Nimitz wrote, if I ever am in a position to avoid airing the Navy's dirty laundry in public, I'm gonna do that. So his awareness of that situation, there's a case of stepping in the same stream, and it's a direct. But what we do know about both men is that they were inveterate readers. We know what was on their side tables, not only during their command tenure, but Eisenhower during his presidency, and even his post-presidency in Gettysburg. He kept a big pile of history books. My wife and I have been into the house where they lived in Gettysburg, and his library was just filled with history books. So I think both of them were sensitive to the fact that the more you know about history, the more you can effectively be part of history. And I think they were very much aware of the fact that they were on the fulcrum of history from 1942 to 1945. Is that responsive? Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay, good, thank you.
Question here, there, and then we're coming down here. And
There,
if
everywhere.
there are folks over there, just give me your hand. We'll get over to you too. Sir.
I have a question more about the Supreme Commander, the unsung Supreme Commander that might have been on the Eastern Front. So knowing that there was a big portion of the war that was being fought over there, could you comment on any of the characters? I don't even know the gentleman's name, but I'm sure he might have had a lot of attributes of these people being representing a big theater of the war.
I know a lot less about the Eastern Front, except to tell you that's where the war was both won and lost. I mean, keep in mind that the United States lost 600,000 men in that war, and that's a lot of men. I'm not going to demean that in any way, but it's not close to the 60 million that were lost in Russia, half of them civilians, in fighting against the Germans on the Eastern Front. And help me here,
Zhukov.
Zhukov was the hero who emerged from that. And Zhukov was one who learned to manage tanks as in groups as well as individual infantry support. And he was very powerful. I don't know about his reading habits. I don't know about his sensitivity to history, but boy, was he politically sensitive. He survived the war without being purged by Stalin and emerged a hero of the Soviet Union and lived to tell about it. So that all to his credit.
Sir.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's a ringer, everybody. Be careful.
Oh, and I have a reason for this. Can you talk about their day-to-day management style? And I want you to please include the sink pack in your answer.
Day-to-day. Nimitz got up every day at usually 6:15, and went for a run, a walk, and what we would call a power walk. And he would go 4-6 miles a day before breakfast. And then he would come back and have breakfast. And as I mentioned, he always had Leighton report to him at 8 o'clock for an intel brief. And then he'd have a staff meeting at 9. And then he'd go around from department to department looking over the shoulders of everybody that was working on various things and see how it was going. But he, at night, tried not to bring that home with him. He would go home. I know what you're after here. It's a recipe. He would go home and ask his aide, Halamar, to prepare him a drink. He says, you know what I like, make my usual, which he called a sink pack. That was his abbreviated title, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Ocean Area, sink pack. So make me a sink pack. Sink pack is considered, you take a large tumbler, you put a cube of sugar in the bottom. You taking notes here, Ryan? Okay. Cube of sugar in the bottom. Then you'd drop 2 drops of Angostura bitters on the sugar. And then you'd put in just enough warm water to melt the sugar. Now, you can actually get this pre-made these days in a liquor store, but this is the way he had to do it. And then you'd fill the glass with ice, and then you'd put in 3 jiggers of bourbon, and float on top of that a jigger of rum. Enjoy. There's a great photograph I actually put in my book, and those of you who are wise enough to buy it this evening will find a photograph of him and Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, each holding a glass with kind of silly smiles on their face. And I'm sure it's because they are sampling a sink pack. He often had people to dinner and would carry on professional conversations then during dinner. He was a meat and potatoes man. He would work after dinner if he had no company, but he tried to get to bed by 10:30, 11 o'clock. He would sleep for a couple of hours and often wake up. That never happens to any of us, does it? You wake up in the middle of the night. And he would read. And guess what he would read? What would he read? History books. It's exactly what he would do until he fell asleep again and get up the next morning and do it all over again. There's a day in the life. All right?
Question right here, then we'll come up to the back.
This is kind of out of your realm, but because you said history doesn't repeat itself, and yet we all look to history. I know I do, and I keep going over it. I am concerned about what is going to happen, and I know this is a question. I don't know whether it's too political or too anything right now, but if you had a solution right now, what would you say? How can we go forward peacefully and still not go into World War III?
It's a question a lot of us are asking ourselves these days. And what makes me feel better, if not good, is the knowledge that America has gone through really tough times before. We fought a civil war. We fought a civil war in this country where 40% of Americans said they didn't want to be Americans anymore, and fought a war with the 60% who were left. And more Americans were killed in that war than in all of America's other wars combined, including World War II. So we've had tough times. We have disagreed with each other. We have killed each other in huge numbers, and we survived. So I cling to that. Abraham Lincoln, in my opinion, the greatest president we have ever had, was once asked, is there a term that can be used for any circumstance, no matter how awful? And he said, there is one, and here it is. This too shall pass. I hope that's helpful.
We've got, that would be a great place to leave it, but we got a few more hands up. So we'll start in the back, then over here, then one down here, and then we're probably going to have to wrap it up.
Oh, that's not working. And you're too far away for me to hear you without it. Uh-oh. Technical problems. Here comes Aaron with a technical solution. Yeah, you're on.
So you mentioned how both their characters, Eisenhower and Nimitz, were very reserved. I was just wondering, like, whether, like, the Soviets with Eisenhower and the Japanese with Nimitz, did that ever come into play with their battle strategies, and did that ever, like, help them have, like, military successes, if they undermine them or not?
I'm sorry, I didn't get.
So the question is whether or not their personality. Their personal characteristics shaped their approach to leading armies at war.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's absolutely central to anyone. And of course, it's not something you can necessarily train someone to do. Reading history helps a lot. But if you have a Patton or a MacArthur temperament, I've been picking on MacArthur tonight too much. MacArthur was a genius for his first 55 years of life, and then because he was a genius, he began to believe his own press reports, and that undermined his effectiveness. But if your temperament drives you in a certain direction, that's who you're going to be. I mean, I taught at the War College, where we try to create or encourage officers to think like a strategist rather than like a technician. And many do, maybe I hope most do. But if that's not a way they approach the world, then you're probably not going to get through to them. So yes, it's a personal, internal characteristic that I think determines in the end. But out of the millions who serve, and the hundreds of thousands who become officers, and the tens of thousands who become field officers, and the hundreds who become general officers, and the one who becomes theater commander. Hopefully that screening process brings that one individual, like these two, to the position where they make the difference. I'm not sure that's responsive. Are you happy with that answer? No. Well, you're going to say yes anyway, because thank you.
In the back.
Craig, is this on?
You are on.
I was reading the Nimitz biography. And
Good for you.
Thank you. One of the things that surprised me is how many close calls Nimitz had. The crash in San Francisco Bay, where the plane, the other time when the pilot got lost in the middle of the South Pacific.
Guadalcanal.
Yeah, and Nimitz's counterparts, who were the commanders of the combined fleet, weren't so lucky. Yamamoto, what was the other guy's name? Koda. Anyway, there were 4 Japanese admirals who ran the combined fleet compared to 1 admiral. So I was wondering, do you see any kind of strategic consistency? Is strategic inconsistency a factor perhaps in Japan's not doing so well?
I'm not sure consistency is the answer, but let me approach it this way. Prior to my book on Midway, another excellent read, by the way. Prior to my book on Midway, the general take on how the Americans won, how the Americans won the Battle of Midway was that we were really lucky. You know, I mean, if you're bent in that direction, you say God was watching out for us because we were outnumbered. I mean, the circumstances were such, and then all of a sudden it just flipped dramatically. And my God, that has to be a product of luck. And one of the things I argue is, no, it's careful planning, it's thinking, it's thoughtfulness, it's decision-making, it's execution by human beings. But luck plays a role in everything, including war. And it is, I believe, a matter of luck, or if you believe in Providence, maybe it was Providence, that protected Nimitz on those occasions. He mentioned several. There was one when he was landing on a seaplane in San Francisco Bay, and it hit a log and flipped over. The guy, the pilot and the co-pilot were both killed. The guy next to him had to go in the hospital. Nimitz's spine was nearly broken. That could have been it for him. But he lived, right? Subsequent to that, he was making a visit to Guadalcanal, and a huge rainstorm had muddied the field, and the plane was taking off, and it didn't quite clear the ground, and it skidded to a halt about 5 feet short of the Lunga River where the plane would have been destroyed, and he would have been killed. And it didn't happen either time. So that's luck, I think. To have Nimitz survive all of that, contrary-wise, Nimitz's counterpart for Japan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, also a brilliant commander, I think everybody agrees that he was a brilliant commander, was shot down and killed. Again, thanks to those dastardly code breakers in the basement who found out his flight itinerary and passed it on to the fighter pilots who found him and killed him. So that's not luck. That's code breaking, perseverance, decision making that ended his life. But yeah.
We've had a lot of great questions tonight. The book Nimitz at War will be for sale in the lobby, and I know that Professor Symonds is willing to sign some copies. But we've got one last question to take us home.
I think the best thing I heard tonight was how both of them handled their personnel situations, especially with Patton.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to answer this or not, but how do you think Eisenhower, as president, would handle the current defense secretary situation?
He wouldn't have that current Secretary of Defense.
Symonds, thank you so much.